One night in 1977, a 29-year-old man woke up with a thought that should have devastated him. I can't live with myself anymore. The depression he'd carried for years had reached an unbearable point. But then, something happened. Something that science is still struggling to explain. Something that transformed this depressed, suicidal man into one of the greatest spiritual masters of our time. His ego didn't just weaken, it exploded. And what was left was something that will challenge everything you believe about who you really are. That man was Eckhart Tolle, and this is the most disturbing story of spiritual awakening you'll ever hear. But before we continue, I need you to understand one thing. What happened to Eckhart that night wasn't a gentle illumination. It wasn't a pleasant, mystical experience. It was a death, a violent death of the self he believed himself to be. And the scariest part is that this death can happen to anyone, including you. Let's go back to that night. Eckhart was lying in his room in London. The darkness wasn't just physical. It was existential. He'd spent years battling paralyzing anxiety, obsessive thoughts that wouldn't let up, an inner voice that criticized every move, every decision, every breath. He was a doctoral student at Cambridge, surrounded by books and theories. But no intellectual knowledge could silence that internal torment. And then came the thought, I can't live with myself anymore. It sounds like a common thought for someone who's depressed, but something different happened in Eckhart's brain at that moment. He asked himself, wait, if I can't live with myself, then there are two of me. There's the I who can't take it anymore, and there's the myself that I can't live with. Which one am I? Really? That seemingly simple question triggered something he describes as being sucked into a void, not a void of fear. A void of total dissolution. The mental structure he'd built over 29 years began to crumble, not gradually, instantaneously, like a building that collapses all at once. Researchers in neuroscience at the University of Zurich published studies in 2024, showing that experiences of ego dissolution involve drastic changes in the activity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This region is responsible for our sense of separate identity. When it deactivates or reorganizes in an atypical way, the boundary between I and not I disappears. And that's exactly what happened to Eckhart that night. He lost consciousness, but not in the usual way. He didn't faint. He simply ceased to exist as the person he knew. The structure of thoughts, memories, and identifications that formed the Eckhart he believed himself to be was completely annihilated. When he woke up the next morning, something had fundamentally changed. He heard a bird singing outside the window, and he had never heard a sound like that before, not because the bird was different, but because he was different. The person who heard that sound was not the same person who had fallen asleep. He describes the first light of day entering through the curtain as love in visible form, not a metaphor, a direct perception. The light had qualities that words can't describe, a luminous softness that was itself pure consciousness. Here comes the part that disturbs most people. Eckhart went for a walk in London that morning, and everything was miraculous. Even the traffic, even the noise, even the people rushing to work, without noticing anything around them. He saw beauty in everything, because the lens of constant judgment had been removed. The filter of the ego that divides the world into good and bad, useful and useless, pleasant and unpleasant, simply didn't exist anymore. But here's what no one tells you. The next 2 years of his life were not a glorious ascent to spiritual fame. They were the strangest and most seemingly unproductive years anyone could imagine. Eckhart stopped studying for his doctorate. He simply abandoned it. He could no longer see any point in accumulating intellectual knowledge when he had experienced something that completely transcended the intellect. He spent most of his time sitting on park benches in Russell Square, in central London, just sitting, watching the world go by, sometimes for hours on end, sometimes for days. His family thought he had gone insane, and how could they not? A promising young man from Cambridge, abandoning everything to sit on park benches like a homeless person. He slept wherever he could, at friends' houses, in a Buddhist monastery, sometimes outdoors in Hampstead Heath. He had no money, he had no job, he had no ambition, in the conventional sense of the word. But he had something that most human beings will never experience: absolute peace. Not the peace of having solved his problems, the peace of having transcended the very structure that creates problems. The ego that suffered had died, and what remained was not a void of depression. It was a void of fulfillment, a space of pure consciousness that didn't need anything external to feel complete. This is disturbing for a specific reason, because it completely challenges our idea of what it means to live well. We are trained from childhood to believe that happiness comes from achievements, from relationships, from possessions, from recognition. Eckhart was literally without any of that, and he was the happiest he had ever been. Going back to what I said before about the question that triggered everything, who is the I who can't live with myself? Eckhart discovered that night that the I who suffered was a mental construct, a collection of repetitive thoughts that had crystallized into a false identity. The ego isn't a real thing, in the sense of being a separate entity. It's a thought pattern, a continuous mental activity that creates the illusion of a separate self. When that pattern collapses, what remains is not nothing. It's everything. The consciousness that was hidden behind the mental noise finally reveals itself. And that consciousness has no problems. It has no fears. It has no anxieties. It simply is present, aware, alive. But wait, if this is so liberating, why does Eckhart call it a dark night of the soul? Why does he describe it as a terrifying process? Because the death of the ego feels like real death. The ego doesn't want to die. It will fight with all its might to survive. It will create fear, panic, sensation of going crazy. That's the scary part of awakening that most spiritual teachers romanticize too much. Eckhart explains that the dark night of the soul is a collapse of the perceived meaning in life, an eruption of a deep sense of meaninglessness. Nothing made sense anymore, no activity, no goal, no achievement. The internal state, in some cases, is very close to what we conventionally call depression. But it isn't depression. It's a form of necessary death before rebirth. Studies in psychology, published in the Journal of Pharmacological Reviews in 2022, show that experiences of ego dissolution can be either positive or negative. The loss of ego can include depersonalization, disconnection from reality, and even psychotic states. But it can also lead to a mystical experience of oneness with a larger whole. What determines the outcome seems to be the ability to surrender to the process rather than resist it. Eckhart surrendered, not because he was courageous, but because he had no more strength to resist. The depression had worn down his defenses to the point of total collapse. And in that collapse, paradoxically, came liberation. This leads us to an uncomfortable question. Most people who seek spiritual awakening want the benefits without paying the price. They want peace without the death of the ego. They want enlightenment as an addition to their current identity, not as a destruction of it. But Eckhart Tolle is clear about this. You can't get enlightened. Enlightenment is the disappearance of the one who was trying to get enlightened. Some people find this through extreme suffering. Like Eckhart, others through deep contemplative practices, some through spontaneous experiences they can't explain. But the common denominator is always the same. The ego needs to get out of the way, and the ego never leaves voluntarily. Remember when I talked about Eckhart Tolle sitting on park benches? People started to notice something strange about him. It wasn't just that he was sitting there. It was the quality of his presence. A calmness that seemed to radiate from him. Strangers started to approach, to sit next to him, to ask questions, not because he was teaching anything, simply because being near him was different than being near other people. They asked, "What do you have that I want? Can you give that to me or show me how to get it?" And he answered something that would become the basis of his future teachings. You already have it. You just can't feel it because your mind is making too much noise. That answer eventually turned into the book, The Power of Now. But it wasn't a book written out of ambition. It was a response to a need. People kept asking. He kept answering. Someone suggested he write it all down, and he did. Here's the deepest paradox of this story. Eckhart Tolle didn't become a spiritual teacher by choice. He didn't decide to be famous. He didn't create a marketing strategy. He simply existed in a certain way, and that way of existing attracted people, like a gravitational field, because deep down, we all know there's something beyond the mental noise. We all have glimpses of pure presence, and when we see someone who lives permanently in that state, something in us recognizes it. That's what I want. That's what I really am. But before I continue, I need to warn you about a real danger. Many people hear stories like Eckhart's and start desperately seeking a similar experience. They want to force the collapse of the ego. They want to provoke their own dark night of the soul. This can be extremely dangerous. Awakening isn't something you make happen. It's something that happens when the conditions are right. It's more important than seeking extreme experiences to cultivate presence in your daily life. Observe your thoughts without identifying with them. Notice the space between one thought and another. Feel the life that pulses in your body right now. Eckhart Tolle teaches that you don't need to go through a dark night of the soul to awaken, although many do. What you need is to stop identifying with the voice in your head. Realize that your thoughts are not you, that your emotions are not you, that your circumstances are not you. What's left when all of that is removed? That is what you really are. Research in neuroscience confirms that people can experience milder versions of ego dissolution in states of flow. When you're completely absorbed in an activity you love, when time seems to disappear and you forget yourself, that's a glimpse of what Eckhart Tolle lives permanently. The difference is that for most people, it's temporary. For Eckhart Tolle, it's become his normal state. Now, I'm going to reveal something that Eckhart Tolle rarely talks about in his public lectures. Something that happened in the years between his awakening and his worldwide fame. During those 2 years on the park benches, Eckhart Tolle went through moments of intense solitude. Not the solitude of someone who feels rejected, the solitude of someone who realizes that almost no one understands what he experienced. He tried to share his experience with the people close to him, but the words seemed empty, like explaining to someone who's never seen colors what red is. His family in Germany was genuinely concerned. His mother called, asking when he was going to go back to being normal, when he was going to get a real job, when he was going to stop wasting his potential. He listened to these questions with compassion, but without being able to answer them satisfactorily. How do you say that he'd already found something infinitely more valuable than any job could offer? There was one particularly difficult moment. Eckhart Tolle recounts that he was sitting on a bench when a heavy rain started. He had nowhere to shelter. He had no money for a coffee. He had no one waiting for him anywhere. The rain soaked his clothes, and he simply stayed there, watching the drops falling, feeling the cold water penetrate his skin, and instead of suffering, what he felt was an inexplicable gratitude for existing. That's the central paradox of Eckhart's experience. The external circumstances were objectively bad, homeless, penniless, no conventional prospect of a future, but the internal state was of absolute peace, because the peace didn't depend on the circumstances. The peace was the natural state of consciousness, when the ego wasn't filtering reality anymore. Going back to that question I mentioned at the beginning, who is the I that can't live with itself? Eckhart Tolle discovered that there are two levels of identity in each human being. The first is what he calls the conditioned self, the collection of memories, beliefs, thought patterns, and emotional reactions that we form throughout life. This self is completely constructed. It didn't exist when you were born. It was assembled, piece by piece, through your experiences. The second level is what he calls pure consciousness, or presence. This self wasn't constructed. It's always been there. It's the silent witness behind all the thoughts and emotions. When Eckhart Tolle says his ego exploded, he means the identification with the first level was destroyed. What remained was only the second level, pure consciousness observing itself. This explains why he could stand in the rain without shelter and still feel peace. The self that would suffer in that situation was the conditioned self. The ego with its expectations of comfort and security. Without that self, there was no one left to suffer. There was only pure consciousness experiencing rain, and rain itself is not suffering. It's just water falling. But here comes something even more disturbing. Eckhart Tolle teaches that most people live in a state of chronic, low-level suffering that they don't even realize. A constant background discomfort, a vague dissatisfaction that never completely goes away. We're so accustomed to this state that we think it's normal, that this is just what life is. He calls this the pain body, an accumulation of negative emotional energy from the past that lives within us as an almost autonomous entity. The pain body feeds on more negativity. It creates situations of conflict. It interprets neutral events as personal attacks. It transforms small inconveniences into tragedies, and we do this unconsciously, thinking we are just reacting to reality. When Eckhart Tolle's ego exploded, the pain body went with it. Years of depression, anxiety, and obsessive thoughts simply disappeared, not because he suppressed them, but because the structure that sustained them ceased to exist. The host died, and the parasites died with him. This brings us to a crucial revelation about what really happened that night in 1977. Eckhart Tolle didn't have a mystical experience in the sense of seeing visions or receiving messages from higher beings. What happened was much simpler, and at the same time, much more radical. He simply stopped thinking, not for a few seconds like happens in meditation, but for a prolonged period. And in that total mental silence, reality revealed itself as it always was. Perfect, complete, whole. Thinking returned later. Eckhart Tolle isn't someone who doesn't think. He thinks when necessary, but the fundamental difference is that he no longer identifies with his thoughts. When a thought arises, he sees it as a mental event, not as part of who he is. It's a cloud passing in the sky. He can observe it, even use it. But he isn't the cloud. You're probably wondering at this moment, how can I apply this to my life? How can I experience even a fraction of what Eckhart Tolle experienced? That's the question every spiritual seeker asks, and Eckhart Tolle's answer is frustratingly simple. Stop searching, not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of realizing that what you seek is already here. The presence that Eckhart Tolle discovered isn't something he acquired, it's something he always had, just as you always have. The only difference is that for most people, that presence is hidden behind the constant noise of the mind. So the first step isn't to seek enlightenment, it's to stop, literally stop, even if only for a few seconds. Perceive the space between one thought and another. Feel the living energy in your hands in this moment. Hear the sounds around you without labeling them. This is the portal, not an elaborate technique, just simple, direct presence. The second step is to notice when you are not present. When the mind has hijacked your attention and is taking you into the past or the future, to worries, to regrets, to fantasies. This recognition itself is an act of presence. You can't perceive that you are distracted without a part of you that is awake. The third step is the most difficult. Don't resist what is. Eckhart Tolle teaches that all suffering comes from a form of resistance, from saying no to present reality. This doesn't mean passivity. It means accepting the present moment as if you had chosen it, and then, from that acceptance, acting if necessary. You've just received knowledge that few channels dare to share in this way. The real story of Eckhart Tolle, not the romanticized version, the frightening version, the version that shows that awakening isn't a walk in the park, it's a death. And if this knowledge touched something in you, if you felt a deep recognition while listening, consider supporting this work by clicking the Super Thanks button below. Each contribution allows more content like this to be created, not as payment, as circulation of energy. Eckhart Tolle teaches that giving and receiving are one single movement. When you support the dissemination of this wisdom, you become part of the collective awakening. You're not just a spectator, you are an active participant in the transformation of human consciousness. Now I'm going to give you something practical, an exercise that Eckhart Tolle recommends for those starting the journey of presence. Find a moment today when you can stop for 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes. It could be right now. If you are in a suitable place, close your eyes. Feel your feet on the ground. Feel the weight of your body in the chair or on the floor. Now ask yourself a question. What will my next thought be? And wait. What happens when you wait for the next thought? Most of the time, it takes a while to come because the question creates a space of alertness, of inner vigilance. In that space, you are present. You are conscious without being thinking. That's the state that Eckhart Tolle lives in all the time, and you've just experienced it, even if only for a second. With practice, that second expands, first to 2 seconds, then to 5, then to entire minutes. Eventually, the space of presence becomes more frequent than the mental noise, and a turning point happens. You realize that you were never your thoughts. You were always the space in which the thoughts appear. This doesn't mean that you will have a dramatic night of ego explosion like Eckhart Tolle. Most people awaken gradually, layer by layer. The identification with thoughts loosens slowly. The intervals of presence become more frequent, and at some point, you look back and realize that something fundamental has changed. You're still the same person in many ways, but there's a lightness, a background peace that doesn't depend on anything. Some signs that you're on the right track. You start to perceive your thoughts as something separate from you. You catch yourself having emotional reactions and manage to observe them instead of being completely absorbed by them. You have moments of spontaneous appreciation for life. For no apparent reason, You feel less threatened by situations that used to throw you off center, other, more subtle signs. You stop needing to be right in arguments. You can hear criticism without your sense of identity being shaken. You find yourself genuinely interested in other people, rather than just waiting for your turn to speak. You notice beauty in ordinary things, things that you might have previously overlooked. If you're recognizing any of these signs in your own experience, comment down below. Tell me which sign resonated with you the most, or, if you haven't noticed any yet, tell me what obstacle you feel is standing in your way. I'm going to read all the comments because this exchange, this dialogue, is part of a collective awakening. None of us awakens alone. We awaken together. Each person who shares their experience illuminates the path for others. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's going through a difficult time, someone who might be having their own dark night of the soul without even knowing what it is, share this video. It might be exactly what that person needs right now. Eckhart Tolle spent 2 years on park benches. His family thought he had lost his mind. They thought he had gone crazy. He lost everything, in the conventional sense. And he gained something that most people don't even know exists. Peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. Presence that transforms every moment into something sacred. Consciousness awakened to itself. His story is frightening because it shows us that the path to freedom passes through the death of who we think we are. But it's also the most hopeful story you could ever hear, because it shows that absolute peace is possible, not just for saints or masters in caves, but for normal people, people who suffer, people who feel lost, people exactly like you. The ego can explode, and when it explodes, what remains isn't destruction, it's freedom. Until the next video, remember, presence is always here. You just need to stop and notice, even now, even in this second, the consciousness that heard these words isn't your thoughts about them. It's something much vaster, something that's always been here, waiting for you to come home. The ego can resist, it can fight, it can create 1,000 distractions, but presence is stronger. It always was, it always will be.